It's halftime at the Bayou Classic. More than 65,000 people are packed into the New Orleans Superdome. The Southern University and Grambling football teams have headed for the locker rooms. Fans from all over the country know they're about to get their money's worth.
I'm thinking, I'm shaking. I'm not really shaking, but I have butterflies. I'm like, okay, I'm nervous. I have to do this. It's coming up.
Southern's high-stepping drum major takes the field.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready? New Orleans, Louisiana. Are you ready for the Southern University marching band from Jags land? The Southern University.
He does a backstep. A Southern University halftime tradition for the last 30 years. Leaning so far back that his hat touches the artificial turf. This extravaganza comes on the heels of the Battle of the Bands, the Friday night exhibition before the football game. 25,000 fans gather to see Southern and Grambling battle it out in the Superdome for bragging rights that are as important as those for the football game itself. The winner? Depends on whose fans you ask.
It's good when you have spies to come all the way to Florida, homeboy. But guess what? This is how you really play contagious.
The Southern Band has been perhaps the most visible icon of the university for decades. In addition to the annual Bayou Classic events, the band has performed for the inaugurations of U.S. Presidents Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, and has entertained fans at 4 Super Bowls. It's also performed for Louisiana governors Jimmy Davis, John McKiffin, and Edwin Edwards. Band director Isaac Greggs says, such appearances are a dream come true for him, but the real reward is what the experiences mean to the students.
I was 15 years old when I came to Southern. Dr. Felton Clark was president, and it was his desire to take a diamond in the rough, polish it in 4 years, and send out a beautiful diamond that would be worth millions. That's what I tried to do.
Dr. Felton G. Clark was the second president of Southern University. His father, Joseph Samuel Clark, was the university's founder and first president. The younger Clark implemented many of his father's ideals in managing the university. Both Clarks set high standards for their students. It didn't matter how well or ill prepared the young men and women were when they arrived at the university. One of their goals was to
take these students as where they are, but when you turn out a student who can, a graduate, who can become a community leader, who uses language, both written and spoken correctly. And I remember J.S. particularly placed a great deal of emphasis on being on time. He would not let a program begin 5 minutes late. If it were to have begun at 7 o'clock, start the program at 7 o'clock. This was a discipline.
He thought that every student should engage in some kind of work, whether the university paid you or not. So all of us had to spend so many weeks in the dining halls serving meals. All of us had to serve time and scrubbing floors and dormitories. That was, he said, and then someone spent time cutting grass. He said, student need to know how to work and have respect for work.
While administrators and professors had high expectations for students, the students had even higher expectations for the faculty and administrators. Many of Southern's first students had parents or grandparents who had endured the harsh burdens of slavery when most African Americans didn't dare dream of a college education.
I always get emotional when I think about this, that people were telling their children, you go to Southern and you learn whatever they're teaching there. So your life will not be as hard as mine. So your life will be easier than mine. So students came to Southern with that in mind. I'm coming here to improve my life, to become a better person, to become proficient in some field.
Popular majors for students in that era included education, home economics, and agriculture.
Teach them how to can food. Teach them how to cook vegetables and plan a balanced diet and that sort of thing. These were the earlier fields. Music was not among that number, but music was always needed to sort of relieve them of these kinds of involvements.
Groups of students performed together shortly after Southern was opened in New Orleans in 1880. Not long after Southern moved to Baton Rouge in 1914, the university had a stage band. The band grew slowly with the university, and despite limited resources, it helped to boost school spirit and pride during Founders Day, graduation ceremonies, and athletic events.
The university provided instruments to the extent it could. It didn't have big budgets. It didn't have much money. Many of the students came with their own instruments. The university had to buy the big instruments like the tubas, the bass drums, and that sort of thing. But it didn't have huge budgets. You know, for band, they had to sort of make it on a shoestring. So the band was necessarily small because of the number of instruments which were available to students at that time.
A number of people helped to build the stage band. Tony Langston, W.H. Hamlin, and Ella Amaker Patty, to name a few. Patty enrolled at Southern University with extensive skills in music, excelling in both piano and violin.
You see, some families felt that no matter what the circumstances were, their children should be exposed to the arts.
Well, she was a hard worker, and she had a better mind than I did, and she was good in her studies, better in her studies than I was. And she was always busy, always trying to do something.
A little known fact to most youngsters is that women performed in the Southern Band in the early years.
That was the only way you could have a kind of fairly decent-sized band. You'd have to let the girls who had been playing instruments too play in the band.
In the 1930s, J.O.B. Mosley began organizing the marching band. He and his successors quickly learned there were some things they would have to do without. There was no money for uniforms and very little money for instruments.
The band didn't have any uniforms. We are in white shirts, black ties, and dark pants. That was the uniform. I'm talking about, this is 46. That was always considered a frill at a university, you know. That was not half as important as paying teachers and getting some books in the library and getting some experiments going on in the lab. Music was kind of at the lower end of the totem pole.
Musical performances generated money for the university. There were separate evening concerts for black audiences and white audiences. The quartet also helped to win over support from the state legislature.
Southern used to always have a quartet. When the presidents, J.S. Clark particularly, would go down to the legislature, he would take a quartet down to entertain the legislators, to soften them, so that they might give them some money. And when that stopped, I'm told, Felton Clark, his successor, said 2 or 3 of them asked for him, where are those people who used to sing those Negro songs?
Successive band directors demanded the very best from the students. They didn't allow money to become a deterrent.
T. Leroy Davis, who came to Southern in the late 40s, had been trained at Tuskegee. And Tuskegee had this military bearing. And sure enough, when he came to Southern, the band did have a military presence, the way they marched and the way they did their formations. Now, when Ludwig Freeman came, he had studied 2 or 3 years at the University of Michigan, and he came with the Michigan idea of the band, you know, with the block letters, with the formations, and with the spelling out of different alphabets and that sort of thing.
During the late 1940s, the band only had several dozen students, but among them, 15-year-old Isaac Benjamin Greggs. Greggs had been encouraged to become a musician from the time he was a very small child.
My mother was a great influence on me because, you see, she had God-given talent. She had no studying of piano. She just played the piano. What she hear at church, she could play it. And I was playing chopsticks when I was 4 or 5 years old. And she really wanted me to play music. But in my neighborhood, I couldn't play no piano in Allendale. So I went to see Louis Armstrong at the Palace Park, and I heard him play. I was completely overwhelmed. And so I went back home and I told her, if you want me to play music, I'll be glad to play it. Just buy me a trumpet.
Little Isaac got his trumpet, and he never stopped playing it. That trumpet landed him in Southern's marching band, in which he was a featured vocalist and soloist.
I've known that they've had a good band since the time I was even in it. And at that time, we didn't have but 64 pieces. And we worked just as hard as we did now with 170 pieces because we enjoyed it.
Greggs was more serious about music than most of his contemporaries. He was a music major. After graduation, Greggs went back to Shreveport to direct a junior high school band. But shortly thereafter, he was drafted into military service. He was able to use that experience to sharpen his musical skills by performing with the military band and the Continental Sextet. After his military stint, Greggs returned to Shreveport, where he resumed directing middle and high school bands. It wasn't long before he realized how much Southern President Felton Clark appreciated his musical talent and charisma. Dr. Clark sent Greggs and his wife a $1 check congratulating them on the arrival of their first child, a gesture Dr. Clark made to only a few former students. Greggs was hired at Southern Laboratory School a few years later. Within a 4-year span, his bands had won 6 of the top awards in the state for performances at Shreveport and Baton Rouge.
Dr. Isaac Greggs' reign as director of the Southern University Marching Band in a moment. But first, a look at how you can pledge your support to Louisiana Public Broadcasting.